One of, if not the most famous French tank of the Second World War was the B1 heavy tank and its improved model, the B1 Bis. These large infantry heavy tanks were some of the most heavily armed and armored tanks existing in the world during the late 1930s. While their production only started in the second half of this decade, they had roots going back as far as 1921, with the Char de Bataille program that started a search for a medium, well-armed tank to fill in the void between the small and numerous Renault FT and the gigantic and rare FCM 2C tanks. One of the proposals to this program was created by the manufacturer of the FCM 2C, Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée. Welcome to what we hope is the first video in a long series covering the development of the Char B1 heavy tank. If you like our content, please do consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All the funds donated by your assistance helps pay for the beautiful illustrations that accompany each of these articles, such as the amazing illustrations that will accompany each of these development articles, and the many illustrations that will be in the final Char B1 and Char B1 Bis articles. Arguably the most important figure of the first years of French tank development was General Jean Estienne. Nicknamed the father of tanks in France, Estienne, a major proponent for the use of armored vehicles from 1915 onward, was named the director of the Special Artillery, the French armored force, in September of 1916. It is largely thanks to his intervention to the Grand Quartier General, France's general headquarters, that the FT light tank reached mass production. Estienne was also a proponent of the Schneider CA-1, the first French tank to see service. At the end of the war, Estienne continued in his role as the leading figure of French armored development. He was still at the head of the Special Artillery, which was attached to the French infantry and renamed the Subdivision de Chars de Combat, and was also named Combat Tank Inspector. In this position, Estienne had large amounts of power over the future development of French armored technology. With the French military having large quantities of largely effective light tanks, thanks to the mass production of the Renault FT, and with the development of large tanks already underway at FCM since 1916, with the FCM-1 and then FCM-2C super heavy tanks, what the French military lacked in his view was an intermediate vehicle, between the dwarves and the giants. A Char de Bataille, a battle tank, thought of as a vehicle of medium weight that would feature a fixed 75mm gun able to engage enemy fortifications and positions, and to move through the devastated terrain typical of trench warfare in an artillery-saturated battlefield. Estienne thought the type would offer the ideal compromise, mounting an armament capable of knocking out enemy fortifications and trenches, something the FT's armament of either a machine gun or a 37mm gun could struggle with, while being vastly more reasonable and easier to mass produce than a monster the size and weight of the 69-ton, 10-meter-long 2C. If successful, the Char de Bataille would have eventually become the workhorse of France's armored force. In 1921, Estienne gathered 5 of the largest French industrial companies: Schneider, Renault, FAMH or Saint-Chamond, FCM and Delaunay-Belleville, and gave them the requirements of the Char de Bataille which he requested them to design. The vehicle was to have a weight of 13 tons and feature a hull-mounted main gun, either a 75mm howitzer with a muzzle velocity of 350 meters per second, or the higher velocity 47mm Model 1902 naval gun with a 750 meters per second muzzle velocity. The tank was to have a turret armed with either 1 or 2 machine guns. It was to have a power-to-weight ratio of at least 8 horsepower per ton and be able to run for 8 to 10 hours. The armor was to be 25mm thick. Most importantly, the program was not planned to result in the immediate adoption of the product that answered to the specifications the most. The plan was that, once the prototypes were produced, the most interesting features from each would be taken to then be featured in a new tank design that would not be the property of a company but of the state. The objective of such a move was to reduce competition and encourage the manufacturers to innovate without the risk of a yet not entirely mastered concept leading to the refusal of a proposal. Once the vehicle that combined the best features of each proposal was adopted, each of the manufacturers involved would play a part in the production. This original policy was named the STN Agreement. In the end, 4 manufacturers would produce new designs for the Char de Bataille program. Delaunay Belleville offered a previous design of theirs, an enlarged FT with a 37mm hull gun and a turret that had little to do with the program's requirements and was swiftly thrown out of the equation. Schneider and Renault cooperated and produced 2 joint prototypes of different designs, while Saint-Chamond and FCM produced their own prototypes individually. FCM, or Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, the forges and shipyards of the Mediterranean, was originally a naval shipyard, which became involved in tank production with the FCM-1 heavy tank design that started development in 1916. While it would remain at the prototype stage, the FCM-1 would serve as the basis for the development of the FCM-2C, a 69-ton behemoth. Ordered at first in January of 1918 and cancelled with the end of the First World War, but ordered again by the request of STN in April of 1919, albeit only for 10 vehicles instead of hundreds as originally planned. The FCM-2C took much of FCM's industrial capacities in the early 20s. The vehicles were completed in 1921 but still received modifications until 1923. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that FCM's Char de Bataille design takes much inspiration and many features from the company's super heavy tank design. The turret of the new tank was straight up the rear machine gun armed turret of the FCM-2C, which would be armed with a Hotchkiss Model 1914 8x50mm Lebel machine gun. Just like the FCM-2C, the FCM Char de Bataille featured a large engine block protruding from the hull, meaning the turret would only cover the forward firing arc. FCM's Char de Bataille was trialled along with the 3 other vehicles in Rueil, starting their presentation on the 13th of May 1924. The FCM Char de Bataille prototype was a 6.5 meters long, 2.52 meters high, 2.05 meters wide tank. It was the longest and highest but also the narrowest and lightest of the 4 Char de Bataille designs, though with a weight of 15,640 kilograms, it still exceeded the requirements of the program by over 2.5 tons. The ground clearance was also the highest at 0.5 meters. The vehicle was powered by a Panhard engine with an output of 120 horsepower at 1,500 rpm. This was the same engine as that of the Saint-Chamond prototype, though the FCM's lower weight meant it had a horsepower per ton ratio of 7.7 horsepower per ton, almost reaching the requirements of the program. While the 2 Schneider Renault featured a more powerful 180 horsepower engine that gave them both 9.5 horsepower per ton. The Panhard engine allowed the FCM Char de Bataille to reach a maximum speed of 17.4 km per hour, which was quite respectable for early 1920s standards. The FCM had the largest fuel tank of any of the Char de Bataille, 500 liters, though it also had the highest hourly consumption of 35 liters. It had the greatest range of all vehicles with 175 kilometers. The tank had a suspension of which the exact workings are unclear. It consisted of 15 small road wheels with a large front idler and smaller rear drive sprocket. The suspension was apparently moved by a chaîne gale, a type of mechanical piece usually used in dams, great at transmitting high efforts at low speeds, which was kept tense by a pneumatic system. The tracks used were inspired by Holt tractor tracks, which used wooden pads with a quite long track pitch. These tracks went all around the hull, as with British rhomboid tanks such as the Mark I and IV. French experience with the CA-1 and particularly Saint-Chamond tanks had shown that tanks with too small of a track run performed far worse in terrain battered by artillery craters. The FCM Char de Bataille featured 25mm of armor. Its main armament was a 75mm gun located on the right of the hull. Unlike other vehicles which had the gun in some sort of casemate or mount, the FCM's gun went straight through the armor plate. Most sources mention a hull machine gun was also featured, though the lack of clear photos of the vehicle's front makes it hard to confirm these claims. The turret is often claimed to feature 2 machine guns, but this appears not to be the case as it was taken straight from the FCM-2C and was of a cylindrical design which would be hard to arm with 2 forward-firing machine guns. As with other tanks of the Char de Bataille program, this turret was the place from which the commander gave orders to the 2 other crew members. In combat, the machine gun was to be used mostly to defend the vehicle from enemy infantry. The driver sat to the left of the hull, with the 3rd crewman tasked with loading the 75mm gun sitting to the right. Considering the vehicle was the narrowest, it appears the 2 crewmen sitting in the hull were quite cramped. The trials of the Char de Bataille lasted from May of 1924 to March of 1925. The FCM appeared to have had an unreliable gearbox, and the tracks using wooden pads used by all prototypes but the Schneider Renault B proved to wear down a lot quicker than metallic tracks. Little else is known about the results of the trial. The FCM is arguably the one which had the least inspiration taken from for the definitive design, which would become the B1. While the suspension of the final product was mostly inspired by the Saint-Chamond, and most of the hull design, as well as features such as the nadir hydrostatic system allowing for accurate hull movement, were taken from the Schneider Renault prototypes, the influence of the FCM appears limited to the track tensioning and clutch systems. The fate of the FCM prototype beyond the trials is unknown, though the most likely way it ended its life was in a scrapyard.